My fiancée demanded I buy her a $3 million mansion, change my name, and even wanted me to quit my job. When I refused, she humiliated me. So I canceled the wedding and walked out. I met Sarah 2 years ago at a friend's wedding. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and commanded attention without even trying. I was a bit withdrawn that night, mostly because I had just gone through a long work week, but she drew me in. Before I knew it, we were deep in conversation. She had this confidence and charm, and I felt lucky just talking to her. By the end of the night, I was hooked, and I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so drawn to someone. At 31, I felt I was finally ready for something real. I'd worked hard to get to where I was, a good job in finance, a comfortable condo in a nice part of town, and enough savings to start thinking seriously about the future. Meeting Sarah felt like finding the missing piece in the puzzle of my life. She was beautiful, witty, and seemed to understand me on a deeper level. It was as if fate had brought us together at just the right moment. Our relationship took off from there, and for the first 6 months, it felt like a dream come true. We spent almost every weekend together, often planning romantic getaways or just exploring the city. I'd never been so enamored with someone. It was like we had our own little world where everything was perfect. She was very passionate, full of big dreams and grand ideas for the future. We'd talk for hours about the lives we wanted to build, the places we'd visit, and even the kinds of homes we imagined living in one day. Sarah had her heart set on a mansion, a huge, sprawling estate with manicured gardens, a pool, and enough space to host grand parties. I laughed it off, thinking it was just fantasy, something she enjoyed daydreaming about. After all, everyone has a dream home, right? But then she started dropping hints, and these hints became more insistent. Sarah began showing me listings for actual mansions, multi-million-dollar estates in exclusive neighborhoods, with price tags that left my jaw on the floor. She'd talk about the amenities as though we were already going to buy one. I remember telling her, half-jokingly, that it was a bit ambitious and maybe we should consider something more modest for our first home. She didn't laugh or joke back. Instead, she looked at me with this intense stare and said, "I thought you wanted to build a future with me." It felt like an ultimatum disguised as a question. I was taken aback, feeling blindsided. This wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. But I shook it off, thinking maybe she was just feeling insecure about our future or that I hadn't done enough to show my commitment. I tried to reassure her, promising that I'd work hard to give us a good life. She seemed satisfied with that answer, at least for a while. Months passed, and eventually, I decided to propose. I'd been saving up for a ring and had spent weeks planning the perfect way to ask her. When the day finally came, I was nervous but excited. I'd expected an emotional reaction, maybe even some happy tears, but when I got down on one knee, her face barely changed. She just smiled and said, "Finally." Then, without missing a beat, she started talking about wedding plans, colors, venues, guest lists, all as if she'd been expecting the proposal and was just glad I'd finally caught up. The planning took off with a speed I couldn't keep up with. Sarah's expectations for the wedding were as extravagant as her taste in real estate. She talked about renting out a castle or having a week-long celebration on a private island. When I suggested we might consider something a bit more manageable, she scoffed and said, "This is supposed to be the most important day of our lives. Don't you want it to be perfect?" I found myself nodding, even though I was deeply uncomfortable with the direction things were going. I'd wanted a beautiful wedding, but it was starting to feel like I was a guest in someone else's fantasy. The stress began to pile up as her demands grew. It wasn't just the wedding, it was every aspect of our life together. She started making comments about my family, suggesting I should see them less often because, in her words, we need to focus on building our own life, not getting caught up in theirs. She'd been charming with them initially, but as we got closer to the wedding, her patience seemed to thin. Anytime I'd suggest a family event or a weekend with my parents, she'd sigh dramatically, making it clear she wasn't thrilled. Then came the topic of my last name. One night, completely out of the blue, Sarah suggested that I should take her last name after we got married. I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but she was completely serious. She started talking about how it would show my commitment to her and how it would unify us in a way that would set us apart. I tried to explain that changing my last name felt unnatural to me, but she didn't budge. She went on a rant about how it was traditional for the man to make a sacrifice to show his love. I argued back, saying that love didn't need to be proven through something so superficial, but it was like talking to a wall. It wasn't just the name change that bothered me, it was the pattern of demands and ultimatums. She wanted everything her way, and if I ever disagreed or set a boundary, she'd accuse me of being uncommitted or unromantic. She had a way of making me feel like I was the problem, like I was failing her somehow by not bending to her every whim. My friends started noticing how drained I was and pulled me aside to ask if I was okay. They told me they barely recognized me anymore, that I seemed tense and distracted all the time. And then came her request for me to quit my job. I work in finance, a career I've spent years building. While it's not my absolute passion, it pays well and provides a stable future. One night, she told me that she didn't want a husband who worked for someone else. She said she wanted a self-made husband, someone who ran his own business or had a high-profile job that commanded respect. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd always thought she appreciated my work ethic and ambition, but now it felt like she was looking down on me for not being successful enough in her eyes. When I told her I had no desire to leave my job, she hit me with, "If you really loved me, you'd understand why it's important." This wasn't love, it was manipulation. She didn't see me as a person with my own dreams and ambitions. To her, I was just a means to her ideal life. It was like she had this checklist of qualities her husband needed to have, and if I didn't fit each one perfectly, I was a failure. One night, we were at a dinner with some of her friends, and someone made a comment about future plans. Sarah immediately started talking about how stubborn I was, going on about how I refused to buy her the mansion she wanted and didn't have the guts to start my own business. Everyone laughed, and I sat there, feeling humiliated. It was one thing for us to have these arguments in private, but to bring it up in front of her friends like that? It was like she wanted to tear me down publicly, to shame me into submission. When we got home, I confronted her. I told her that what she'd done was hurtful and humiliating, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she looked at me coldly and said, "If you're going to be with me, you need to toughen up. I have high expectations, and if you can't meet them, maybe you're not the right person for me." That was the last straw. I went to bed feeling like a stranger in my own life, wondering how I'd allowed things to get this far. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, and this wasn't the woman I'd thought I'd marry. I'd been holding on to a fantasy of who she was, refusing to see the reality right in front of me. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to meet her endless demands. The next morning, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called her and told her the wedding was off. At first, she laughed, thinking I was bluffing, but when she realized I was serious, she exploded. She called me a failure, accused me of wasting her time, and told me I'd regret this for the rest of my life. But I didn't let her words get to me. I'd already wasted enough time trying to please someone who didn't care about me, only what I could give her. I packed my things, moved out, and didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, I went through a whirlwind of emotions. There were days I missed her, days I questioned if I'd made the right choice, and days I felt nothing but relief. I reached out to friends and family, people I'd neglected during the relationship, and they welcomed me back with open arms. They'd seen the toll Sarah had taken on me, even if I hadn't noticed it myself. I started to realize just how much of myself I'd sacrificed in that relationship, trying to meet her impossible expectations. One day, I found an old photo of us from when we first started dating. We looked so happy, so carefree. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of clarity. I'd been holding on to a memory, hoping that somehow, if I just loved her enough, she'd go back to being the person I'd fallen for. But that person was gone, replaced by someone who only saw me as a stepping stone to her perfect life. Looking back, I'm grateful for the experience, painful as it was. It taught me a lot about my worth, about what I deserve, and about what real love looks like. Real love isn't a list of demands or ultimatums. It's about mutual respect, understanding, and compromise. It's about building a life together, not one person bending over backward to meet the other's every whim. Walking away was hard, but staying would have been harder. I'd lost myself in that relationship, and now, for the first time in a long time, I feel free. Free to live my life on my own terms, to pursue my own dreams, and to wait for someone who will love me for who I am, not for what I can provide. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: love should make you feel valued, not diminished. It should lift you up, not weigh you down. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away from someone who doesn't see your worth. I know now that I deserve better, and I'm grateful I had the strength to choose myself in the end. Get lifetime access to my prompts library, https://bit.ly/4@9kn. It's been about a year since I walked away from Sarah, and my life has transformed in ways I never anticipated. It was an incredibly painful decision to cancel the wedding, but looking back, I realize it was the best thing I could have done for myself. In the days immediately following the breakup, I felt a lot of sadness, anger, and even guilt. Walking away from someone I'd once thought I would marry was difficult to process, and I struggled with what felt like an empty future. I wasn't sure if I'd find love again or if I'd ever feel the same sense of certainty I'd had with Sarah in the beginning. Initially, I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. I replayed our entire relationship, analyzing every conversation and argument, trying to figure out how I had missed so many red flags. I realized that I had been too focused on Sarah's potential, on who I thought she could be, and ignored who she was actually showing herself to be. I had been so desperate for her approval that I lost sight of what I truly wanted in a partner and in a relationship. Accepting that was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was a necessary first step in the process of moving on. In the weeks after the breakup, my friends and family were a huge support. They reminded me of who I was before Sarah and encouraged me to reconnect with the hobbies and interests I'd neglected. For the first time in years, I had weekends entirely to myself, without anyone dictating what I should or shouldn't be doing. I started hiking again, a hobby I'd always loved but had stopped doing because Sarah wasn't interested. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always wanted to do but never got around to. And slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. I also spent a lot of time reflecting on the kind of relationship I truly wanted. Sarah's behavior had left me questioning if I was being too demanding, too rigid, or even too small-minded as she'd called me. But as I reflected, I came to realize that the problem wasn't that I'd had standards, it was that I'd let someone else undermine them. I decided I wasn't going to let that happen again. During this period, I reconnected with some old friends and spent more time with my family. The people closest to me had been gently trying to warn me about Sarah, but I had ignored them, convinced they just didn't understand. Being back in their lives reminded me of the warmth and support I'd been missing. For the first time in a long time, I felt valued and appreciated for who I was, not for what I could provide or how I measured up to someone else's ideal. One day, my sister pulled me aside and said something that really stuck with me. She told me, "Love should make you feel at home. It shouldn't feel like an uphill battle every day." That was exactly what I'd been missing with Sarah. With her, every moment felt like a performance, like I was constantly trying to be good enough or impressive enough. But love isn't about proving yourself, it's about sharing your life with someone who sees you as you are and values you for it. That was the realization I needed to fully let go. Months later, I started dating again, though this time, with a very different perspective. I was no longer trying to prove myself or fit someone's ideal. I wasn't interested in grand gestures or perfect checklists. I wanted someone I could be real with, someone who valued me as a person, not as a project. I went on a few dates, some of which were great and some that were disasters, but I learned to enjoy the process rather than focusing on the outcome. Then, about 6 months ago, I met Laura. Our connection felt different right from the start. She was kind, funny, and incredibly down to earth. On our first date, we ended up sitting in a small cafe for hours, talking about everything from our childhoods to our favorite books. There was no pressure, no need to impress each other. It felt natural, like catching up with an old friend. And for the first time since the breakup, I felt a genuine sense of hope. Laura is nothing like Sarah. She doesn't care about fancy houses or extravagant lifestyles. She values experiences, relationships, and authenticity. She's ambitious but grounded, and she has a strong sense of who she is and what she wants in life. Being with her has been a breath of fresh air. We don't have to prove anything to each other, and there's no constant pressure to live up to some impossible standard. We're just two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company and want to build something meaningful together. What I've learned over this past year is that real love isn't about perfection, wealth, or social status. It's about connection, respect, and mutual understanding. I had spent so much time with Sarah trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine, that I lost myself in the process. With Laura, I don't have to pretend or constantly be on guard. I can simply be myself, and that's enough for her, and for me. One night, a few months into my relationship with Laura, we were talking about past relationships, and I found myself sharing the story of Sarah with her. I told her about the demands, the manipulation, and the pressure I'd felt. I even shared some of the things Sarah had said, things that had made me feel small and inadequate. Laura listened quietly, never interrupting, but I could see the compassion and understanding in her eyes. When I finished, she took my hand and said, "Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you found your way out of that." Her response meant everything to me. She didn't try to analyze it or make me feel better, she simply acknowledged my experience and supported me. In that moment, I realized I'd found someone who truly understood me, someone who respected my past but didn't judge me for it. Now, looking back, I feel grateful for the experience with Sarah, even though it was incredibly painful. It taught me a lot about myself, about what I want, and about what I deserve. I've come to see that sometimes, the hardest lessons lead to the most valuable growth. I had to go through that relationship to learn what love isn't, and to understand what real love feels like. To anyone who's been in a similar situation, who feels like they're constantly compromising their values and bending to meet someone else's expectations, I want to say this: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Real love doesn't come with a list of demands or ultimatums. It doesn't make you feel small or unworthy. Real love makes you feel valued, supported, and at peace. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to walk away from a relationship that doesn't make you feel that way. As for me, I'm in a good place now. My life may not be filled with mansions or grand gestures, but it's filled with warmth, connection, and a sense of belonging that I wouldn't trade for anything. I've learned to trust myself and to seek a partner who values me for who I am, not for who they want me to be. And with Laura, I feel like I've finally found that person.